Alright, what's up guys? This is Blue TCG coming at you with another Vanguard deck profile. This time for premium, this is going to be the Luard deck profile that I actually brought this exact list to Bushiroad Spring Fest 2022 this past weekend, and it performed pretty well. It performed 3-3 overall, and our team went 3-3 as well at the tournament. So this build of Luard is going to be a lot more mid-range and control focused than some of the Luard builds you guys are probably used to seeing on the internet. But with that aside, I do want to go right into the deck profile. But just before I do so, I do want to show off the little Field Center promo that we got from Bushiroad Spring Fest. I'm not sure if I'm going to be using this for Vanguard, but definitely as a Yu-Gi-Oh player, I'll probably be showing this off. Just represent the Vanguard crew. But without further ado, let's go right into the deck profile. So we're starting off with the grade zeros and triggers. We're running the standard V-Series starter here, Dragprince Rute, excuse me. Dragprince Rute is pretty much the standard V-Series starter. You draw a card when rode upon, and if you went second, or more specifically, if your opponent's at grade 1 upon this being ridden upon, you do get a quick shield. That quick shield is usually not used for guarding. That quick shield is usually going to be used for discarding as cost for grade 2 Nemain, and we'll go over that later, grade 2 Nemain's role in this deck, but because it is a little bit of a non-standard option for Luard. But with that aside, Dragprince Rute is pretty much very important for having that grade 0 in the soul as an extra resource for getting your soul charge, or excuse me, your soul blast later on, because the soul is definitely one of the most important resources for the toolbox that this deck has in terms of the grade 1s. And on top of that, the draw power that this deck gets early game is extremely important for being able to see those grade 3s, since we aren't running too many grade 3s. Standard Luard builds run 4 to 5. We are running 5 in this build, so that being said, we do want to consistently not get grade stuck, and we want to consistently go through most of our decks, so that draw power is very important. So the V-Series starter, of course. Now onto the triggers and the other grade 0s. We are running 4 Heal Guardians. So Heal Guardians are pretty much the standard option right now in the meta. Ever since they were released in the clan collections, the first and second volumes, they have been pretty much a great addition to the game. I think the Heal Guardians do a great job of, reining in the grade 2 bullying that was prevalent all throughout most of the end of V Premium. So being able to, slow them down by giving your Vanguard plus 10,000 power if you haven't ridden to grade 3 yet for the game allows you to get that survivability that Luard definitely needs, because Luard is definitely a slow deck towards the early game, and until you get to that Morfessa stride, you aren't really doing too much, so you're going to need that power boost, especially if you're going second. And the fact that you can also decide to reduce crit instead can be really useful, especially against some Force 2 decks such as Regalia, because Regalia, they can go into Marduk while you're still at grade 2, which is devastating, especially with the Force 2 marker on the Vanguard circle, so you might need that crit reduction might come in handy, especially in the Regalia matchup and other matchups where Force 2 comes into play, or any forms of double crit early game while you're at grade 2. And then, of course, the second ability to get a damage doesn't really come up too often, because most players will give you a damage at some point early game, but if they decide to damage deny you, then you can give yourself 1 damage that you can go into like a Liafail, for example, or any other card that requires Counterblast in order to get going. So Heal Guardians, again, great for this deck. And also, because they're grade 3, it's nice that they're searchable off of Branwen, which is our grade 3 searcher in the deck. And we'll go over Branwen later. But yeah, that's our heal triggers. Then we are running 4 Stride Fodder crit. So the Stride Fodder crit is not really any surprise. This is pretty much the go-to critical trigger for all Luard decks, because it functions both as a 10k critical trigger, as well as being an option for discarding as stride cost. And the nice thing about being able to discard this as stride cost is that it gives you an extra trigger in the drop zone for the purposes of Morfessa's Ritual 10 skill, which is pretty much the centerpiece of this entire deck. That's what we're trying to achieve here. That's the win condition for this deck. So this being able to get closer to that Ritual 10 is really useful, because it fulfills that on its own, at least partway through, and at the same time it'll allow you to get that stride without, at least early game, get that stride without having to discard a bunch of cards from your hand. Sometimes it is preferable to actually discard more cards from your hand, just in case you're really desperate for ritual, but usually you'll be either discarding this or you'll be fulfilling the stride cost using Luard's own skill. So, but the stride crit is still great because it's a 10k critical trigger. So, of course, 4 of those. And then on to some of the less common triggers that you'd probably not see in most Luard builds. we're running 1 V-Series Draw Trigger, 2 Belial Owl, and we'll go over the other card that I was about to put down a little later because I think that one's more standard. But the combination of these 2 cards is a little non-standard, especially at the ratios they're being run in this deck. So we're running 1 of the Draw Trigger because, as I said in the beginning of this video, this deck is a little more mid-range and control-focused than some of the other Luard builds you're used to seeing. We're not typically going into Morfessa on our first ride. We're typically going into Dragabyss Luard on our first ride. Just try to build up that hand economy that we built up, that we will be building up with Liafail and Nemain early game, and this Draw Trigger kind of helps support that. Not to mention that the 5k shield, while normally being a liability, is actually a good thing for this deck because it allows us to be more encouraged to pitch this for something like Nemain or any other card that requires discarding. That way we get an extra trigger in the drop zone as well for our Morfessa Ritual 10. And then the 2 copies of Belial Owl, this can definitely become 3 if you want to get rid of the Draw Trigger, if you're not feeling like the Draw Trigger is that useful. Which, speaking of which, I do want to eventually replace this with the Draw Trigger that came in set 4 of Overdress, because that Draw Trigger in Overdress is basically strictly better. It gives an extra 5k shield to itself when your opponent's at grade 3 or greater. So I do think that eventually I want to get that in replacement for Dragwizard Bad. But at the same time, I think you can definitely run 3 Belial Owl if you prefer to get that more crit pressure, because Belial Owl is a recursive crit trigger that we got in G era, and it's long been one of the mainstays of Luard builds in general. So Belial Owl is not only useful for being self-recursive by going back to the deck at the end phase, but also if it's retired for the cost of any of your units that need to retire for their cost or ability, then you get to draw a card, which basically allows you to go net neutral if you are taking into account that most of the cards that retire as cost make you go heavily minus, but Belial Owl allows you to still pull off those skills while maintaining your card advantage that you really worked hard for. So that's why Belial Owl is still in this deck. Those are the options that you have for the crit trigger, and I do think that, again, you can run 3 Belial Owl instead of 2, but I do prefer having that 1 draw trigger for the reasons mentioned earlier. Then we're running 4 Cursed Raven. This card, my goodness, is some of the most grimy effect triggers that basically represent all that G-Era has come to be in terms of its effect on premium. It's been said by a couple of people on the Vanguard internet and spaces all around that basically in order for an effect trigger to be run in this day and age in premium, it has to be either really strong or it has to just be that important for the deck, and Cursed Raven happens to be both. This card is not only recursive for basically as long as you keep drawing it, but also it's a stand trigger that helps you get multi-attacks on your Morfessa turns, which in turn makes it that much harder for your opponent to be able to guard the full Morfessa turn when you combine it with Dagda and some of the other multi-attack enablers. So Cursed Raven, by its own skill, it's an activated ability while you have Generation Break run 1. You would rest this unit and put this unit on top of your deck, then you shuffle your deck, then you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, and you can call up to 2 of them to your rearguard circle as rest, and the rest go to the bottom of your deck. But at the end of the turn, the units called with this effect are retired. Now the thing is, this Cursed Raven still allows your units that are placed on rearguard circle to get their auto abilities if that's applicable, which not only can let you do like a Liafail play or a Charon play, but it can also allow you to do Nemain from it, which we are running the grade 2 OG Nemain. So when Nemain's placed by Cursed Raven, you can still counterblast 1 pitch and then draw 2, which is an effective actually I believe plus 2 in that scenario, because Cursed Raven technically does go -1 for its cost. But the fact that that interaction is allowed is pretty much like insane, because this allows you to get your Ritual 10 much more quickly than otherwise enabled by some of the combos that Cursed Raven typically normally allows. So Cursed Raven, of course, can be done for many things, but typically if you have these in your hand, you do want to save them for your Morfessa turn. You don't really want to put them back in the deck until you're ready for Morfessa, because by the time you go for your Morfessa turn, your deck will be pretty thin, and that way when you put back Cursed Ravens, you're more likely to see them when you actually go for your drive checks, so that way you can get a restanding Dagda or a restanding Branwen or any other card that can really benefit from running the stand trigger. So 4 Cursed Raven. And then last to round out our trigger lineup, we've got 1 Overtrigger. Yes, we are running the generic Overtrigger, the Cray Elemental one. And the reason for this is that I don't feel like Amartanoa, who's the United Sanctuary, or excuse me, Keter Sanctuary Overtrigger, I don't feel like he's that good for Luard, honestly. I feel like the extra drive checks on rearguard circles are not as beneficial because typically when you go for your Morfessa turn, you're not really looking for drive checks because, you know, that can potentially deck you out by that point. You're really looking for making it hard for the opponent to guard. You really want them to use a bunch of cards from hand. And actually, I feel like getting the extra 100 mil is more valuable in terms of knocking out a bunch of cards from your opponent's hand than getting extra drive checks on your rearguard circles, because typically when you go for your 100 mil, they have to have a perfect guard in their hand, otherwise they're taking 2 damage. And typically, you know, you'll try to keep your opponent at 4 damage for your Morfessa turns so that they're forced to block everything. That way they can't take a damage and be like, all right, let me get my triggers so that's easier to block subsequent attacks. No, you want that 100 mil so that you force them to use PGs. That way they have to burn 3 cards in their hand each time they want to guard one of your attacks, at least in the case of 100 mil. But at the same time, I'm going to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Overtriggers, so I am more likely to run the Overtrigger that people would not typically expect. But that being said, I do think there is value in running this Overtrigger as opposed to some of the other Overtriggers available, at least in the case of Amartanoa. But yeah, so that does it for our trigger lineup. The last part of our grade 0 lineup is actually going to be Vicreau. I know I spent a lot of time on the grade 0s and triggers, but it's very important to understand the role that each one of these cards plays in the deck, because this deck again is not too standard. This is not the kind of build that you'll typically see people be running. So I do want to make sure that every single card is understood to its full potential. And Vicreau is one of those cards that still plays a role in Luard to this day, even though it is not your starter. It is your go-to target off of a Luard Stride bonus, because it is the only card in this deck, at least in the main deck, that we're running that has Ritual. And let's go ahead and read Vicreau's skill just for those of you that are not aware of it. So it has Forerunner, which will not come up for this deck because we're not running it as a starting Vanguard. But then the second ability is a Ritual 3, active when there are 3 or more grade 1 cards in your drop zone. You put this card into your soul, and then when this unit is retired from rearguard by the effect or cost of your card with the Ritual ability, you may pay the cost. If you do, you countercharge 1. So this not only gives you back your counterblast, but also gives you back your soul, which is basically both of what this deck needs in order for the toolbox to just keep running, in order for that hand economy to keep, you know, chugging along, in order for us to make all the plays that we need. And this card accomplishes all of it. So it still fulfills a great role in this deck, and I think that it deserves to still have a spot, even though we're not running it as the starting Vanguard anymore. I do like going into this off of the Stride bonus, because not only do we get to retire because it has Ritual, but we also get to retire it for a cost of like Dragabyss or even Morfessa in order to get back that soul and that counterblast that we used. So Vicreau is very good, and I think it still plays a role in this deck. And now for the grade 1s. We've got only 16 grade 1s in this deck, unlike some of the other Luard builds that you might see where they're running 18 or even 20 grade 1s. We're running only 16, so let's go ahead and go over each of them right here. And I actually forgot to turn these around when I was filming the grade 0s and the trigger units, so from now on I'll go ahead and show them in the proper direction. So now we got 4 Branwens. Branwen is the grade 3 searcher. In Luard specifically, the grade 3 search allows you to discard a card, which helps you out in getting that Ritual 10 that we want from Morfessa. So that's why Branwen at 4 copies I think is good. Now a lot of people will run this at 3 or 2 copies, and I actually don't very much agree with that, because I do think this is your most important grade 1 for your Dagda turns as well. This card can get 28,000 power on its own. If it's like a soul attacker, it can get 28,000 power off your Morfessa, which is good for hitting a magic number against every single deck, at least for the most part. If we're considering the force decks, the Excel decks, even the Protect decks, all of them will hit against all of those cards or decks. This card will hit a magic number, because this card gets a 13k power from its own ability when you have 3 or more grade 1s in your drop zone, and the 13k base of Force Clans is usually the highest base power available to most decks. So the fact that this card can hit a magic number on its own, and then combined with Morfessa, can hit the 28,000 power number, which typically involves, guarding with, let's say, 20,000 power, 20,000 shield from their hand. They still have to guard 2 cards from hand, and they have to find 20,000 somehow. So they have to use a lot of cards from hand in order to be able to guard this well, or cards that they might not otherwise want to use. And of course, the reason why we're running 4 of these as well is that we really want to see those grade 3s by the time we get to the grade 3 turn. You don't want to miss a single ride for this deck, because this deck does need to get to Morfessa as fast as it can. Otherwise, you're just going to get steamrolled by most of the decks in Premium right now. So for Branwen, and then we are running 4 Karma Collector. Karma Collector, you probably didn't expect to see it over a card like Ezreal. And the reason why we're running Karma Collector over Ezreal is that Karma Collector allows you to countercharge when you have another Karma Collector in your drop zone, which you'll find yourself having another PG in your drop zone quite often, just because of all the discarding, all of the ways this deck can get grade 1s in the drop zone. I think you actually see Karma Collector pretty often in the drop zone, and I found personally that extra Counterblast to be extremely useful over being able to recycle a PG back into the deck, because even if you get Ezreal back in the deck, you're actually minusing yourself from Ritual a little more. Not to mention that I don't think you'll be able to pull off Ezreal's skill very often in the game to warrant running 4 copies of it in the deck as opposed to 4 copies of Karma Collector, where each time you pull off Karma Collector, it is of extreme value because you're getting that Counterblast back, and that's another Counterblast that you can save from having to use a Soul Blast in order to get the Counterblast back with a card like Charon or any other card that will countercharge in this deck, other than Vicreau, of course, which gives you back your Soul and your countercharge. So I do think Karma Collector is very good in this deck. And of course, sometimes riding into Karma Collector is actually really good because a 6k base, which in the past, a 6k base was a little not very good, but nowadays where there's so much damage denying, I think having a 6k base is really nice to ride into because you basically inherently damage deny them if they're riding into an 8k Vanguard on grade 1. And that way you're still getting your drive check, you're still getting the card draw that you're looking for by attack with your Vanguard, while not giving them the damage that they might want in order to start getting their combos going off, especially for a deck like Regalia or even Nightmare Dolls if they went first. So 4 Karma Collector is really good, and it's not a bad card to ride at all, especially since typically the combo in this deck, let me keep this here for a second. I'll explain more later about Liafail, but basically, if you ride this on grade 1 and you ride into Liafail on grade 2, then you can use Liafail to call Charon, and then you can use Charon to Soul Blast this card from the Soul to the drop zone, and then you get back a Counterblast, of course, right? But the most important part is that Karma Collector will now be in the drop zone for its own ability so that you can countercharge for the rest of the game off of its skill. So I think that's actually really good. It's not a bad card to ride at all, but typically you'll be riding either Branwen or one of the cards we'll talk about a little later, but for now let's talk about Charon. I mentioned a little about Charon already, but we're running 3 copies of him, and Charon remains one of the most important grade 1s in this deck. And now you're probably wondering, why am I not running 4 copies then? Well, the reason for that is typically 3 copies is just good enough. This card is searchable off of your Liafail, searchable off of your Luard, searchable off your Dragabyss Luard, searchable pretty much by all the means that you can think of. So we don't really need 4 copies. Another reason we don't need 4 copies is that we're typically only needing his skill up to a certain number of times per game. Not to mention that each time you use the skill to get a Counterblast back, then you'll be Soul Blasting, and you don't have infinite Soul in this deck by any means. Even though we have ways of getting the Soul back with like Nightmare Painter or Vicreau or any other card that Soul charges, we typically don't want to be using Soul too often because we want to have the Soul available for one of our G Guardians that we're running in the G Zone. So I do think 3 copies of Charon is still good enough for our purposes, and also because he's searchable very easily with various methods in this deck, and also he's, you can send him back with a card like Dragfall Luard, which is one of the grade 3s that we're running. Since you can send him back to the deck with that effect, if necessary, then I don't think you need more than 3 copies for him to be effective. So 3 copies of Charon, you'll be using this very often, especially with Liafail and others, to get your Counterblast back or to call something from deck for free. That way you can be on top of your resource game and things like that. So now, I was going to mention Knies earlier, but when I was talking about a Karma Collector and Branwen, but we're running 2 copies of Knies, and Knies is probably not a common pick for most Luard builds today, just because it is a little slow. It's technically more of a control card rather than something that gets you closer to fulfilling Morfessa. But I found this card to be extremely important for the consistency of this deck, at least the toolbox that I was aiming for, which is a more mid-range and control-focused toolbox. And in order for mid-range and control to be effective, you do need to have that consistency early game. Otherwise, you're just going to fall behind very quickly, especially to all the decks that are around these days that can play fast, that can kill you on their first stride, etc. So the important part about Knies is actually both skills, especially if you have him in your starting hand. He's probably your best grade 1 ride because he allows you to check tops upon riding him on Vanguard Circle. you can check top 7 for either a Dragheart Luard, which is the grade 3 old school Luard from the trial deck, or you can also search Dragwizard Liafail. And Liafail is probably one of the best grade 2s early game. So having a way to search through a lot of your deck, 7 cards is a lot, by the way. Having a way of searching through 7 cards in your deck for either one of those 2 cards is terrific. Not only that, it does not require discarding afterwards, so it's effectively plus after you, on top of the fact that you get to draw off of your V-Series starter. So I think Knies is very good just for the first ability alone. And then the second ability is like the icing on the cake. When placed by an ability, you can Soul Blast 1 and your opponent chooses a rearguard to retire. That's the control element that's the control side that we're emphasizing for this deck, and Knies plays right into it. I think it's come up very often where I've played Knies when they've had only one rearguard, and that rearguard happened to be important, something like one of their combo pieces or even their Forerunner starter if they're running that. Being able to retire that is very great and also keeps you up in hand economy and card advantage, etc. It allows you to this can still be retired later on for the cost of like a Dragabyss Luard or even a Morfessa later on. So it still functions very well in this deck, and I think at 2 copies is basically just the right amount. I haven't found myself wanting more copies of it because, again, it is an extra consistency card for the grade 1 ride, but it's not per se like you need to ride this grade 1 or else you lose. No, it's not anything like that, but it's definitely a great card to see if you haven't seen a Liafail or a Dragheart Luard or any grade 3 for that matter at the moment. So yeah, 2 copies of Knies. I know I spent a lot of time talking about those cards, but now we're going to talk about some of the 1-ofs that we're running in the grade 1 lineup, and this will do it for the grade 1s, I assure you. So let's go over the 1-ofs. We've got 1 copy of Swordbreaker, old school Swordbreaker, as you might notice. 1 copy of Nightmare Painter, and this is the Nightmare Painter that's come in V-Series, and then 1 copy of Light Elemental Honoly. So we'll go over each one individually, but I think all of these like really go hand in hand in terms of their purpose, and they're all being run at 1 copy for similar reasons. So let's go over each of them. We're running 1 copy of Swordbreaker because we typically don't need this card more than once. This card is like basically your early game target off of Liafail most of the time. If you don't have 2 Liafails or you don't have a Liafail and a Nemain in your hand, then you typically just use 1 Liafail to call Swordbreaker from your deck, and then you use Swordbreaker's ability to Soul Blast the grade 1 that you rode earlier, and then you draw a card. That way you, again, start building your hand economy from early on and prepares you for the control game that will come later, which Morfessa will help you accomplish that as well. Not to mention that Swordbreaker herself Soul Blast the grade 1, as I mentioned, and can function as a future grade 1 retire fodder so that you can get closer to your Ritual 10. So Swordbreaker is great as a 1-of because you don't want to see it in your hand. But if you do happen to see it in your hand, it's not a huge deal. You can just ride it or call it as a retire fodder. But generally speaking, I think at 1 copy is just perfectly fine. And then we have 1 copy of Nightmare Painter for refilling our soul with like a grade 0 typically is what you do, because it does say you can put back a grade 1 or less from your drops into your soul. Usually you don't want to put back a grade 1 itself because you do want to keep your ritual up, but also at the same time putting it back you don't want to put back a trigger unit either because of course trigger units count as grade 1s for the purposes of Morfessa. So typically you want to put back either a Vicreau, or usually if you have the V-Series starter, Dragprince Rute. If you have that in your drop zone, which is not uncommon at all, you can usually put back Dragprince Rute into your soul, so that way you avoid having to put back a trigger unit or any other grade 1. And the extra 3,000 can come up, but usually you're only using Nightmare Painter to refill your soul. So that's why it's a 1-of. It's not really too important in the deck, but I do think it's been useful at 1 copy. And finally, I think this is the most important tech card that I've had in this deck for the time I've been using it, is 1 copy of Light Elemental Honoly. Now, Honoly is basically the way you survive early to mid game against fast-paced decks that multi-attack a lot. For example, Nightmare Doll, Regalia. I can think of a lot more decks that are in tier 1 that really give Luard, that would ordinarily give Luard basically a really bad matchup. I think Honoly is like the good neutralizer against those decks. It makes sure that we can survive early game, on top of being basically a very relevant threat that your opponent must eliminate if possible. Otherwise, they're going to have a hard time killing you basically going into late game. And by then, you'll be able to go into Morfessa, you'll be able to get cards out of their hand, and basically Honoly just adds to that in terms of them not being able to kill you. And oftentimes when Honoly comes into play, especially against Regalia, you'll be able to deck them out because Regalia doesn't have much of a way to remove Honoly. They really need Counterblast on cards like Norn and and sometimes Amaruta Afros, and even I think Yggdrasil also costs counterblasts. But yeah, if they don't have enough VARs, then Honoly is going to give them real problems, and I think this card is a really good tech card for this deck. The great thing about Honoly and why we run him at 1 copy, I should probably explain what Honoly does before I explain why he's at 1 copy in this deck. Basically what Honoly does is like a floodgate. All rear guards cannot attack the Vanguard in the 5th or more battle unless counterblast 1 is paid. So basically what this means is that no matter what the attack is, Vanguard or rear guard attacking, you count it to the number of battles of that turn that are attacking the Vanguard, and once it is the 5th or more battle of a rear guard attacking the Vanguard, then they have to pay counterblast 1 before they attack, otherwise they cannot attack. So that's really good, and that is how you basically rein in against decks that multi-attack and seek to kill you before you even go into Morfessa. Now the reason why this is at 1 copy in this deck is that we can easily search it with all of our grade 1 toolbox cards like Liafail and Luard, as aforementioned. Not to mention that if we do find it removed from the field, like either retired or put into the soul by some decks, then we can easily get it back out of the soul or out of the drop zone back into the deck with Luard, and then we'll be able to call it later on with some other effects. Now, do keep in mind that when you call Honoly, you do have to pay a counterblast, and this comes up if you have counterblast available. If you have no counterblast available, meaning that all of the damage in your damage zone is already face down, then you don't need to turn a card face down because, in Vanguard you do as much of the effect as possible. So you don't have to worry too much if you don't have any face-up damage. You can still call Honoly. It's just that if you do have face-up damage, you do have to make sure to pay that counterblast. All right, so that does it for the grade 1 lineup. 16 grade 1s, again, I think this is all that's necessary. Now, of course, this is a little low number of grade 1s for a Luard deck, but I think that the other cards in this deck really seek to help the consistency, and I found that having 16 grade 1s wasn't that much of a setback in terms of being able to still fulfill Morfessa easily. All right, so now into the grade 2s, we've got 4 copies of Liafail. Liafail is probably the most important grade 2, as I said, in the early game. This is the card you usually want to see in your hand for grade 2 gaming, especially as a Rye target, because his ability triggers on both Vanguard and Rearguard Circle. Let's go ahead and read his ability quickly. So when this unit is placed on Vanguard or Rearguard Circle, you counterblast 1, search your deck for a grade 1, call it to Rearguard Circle. It has to be an open Rearguard Circle, and then you shuffle your deck. So it's a very simple skill. It costs a counterblast. You call it to open Rearguard Circle. Now the important thing about Liafail that most people probably do not take advantage of is the fact that if you call Liafail, you can go into if you have only 1 damage for Liafail, you can call Liafail, right? So you counterblast 1, and then you search your deck for like a card like Honoly, for example. You can call Honoly behind Liafail, and when you call Honoly, you probably don't have any face-up damage left, especially if it's like the second turn of the game where you have only 1 damage, right? But Honoly doesn't need to. Honoly, you have to pay the counterblast when you call it. But if you have no face-up damage, as I just mentioned, then you don't have to counterblast. Like it's you do as much of it as you can, but doesn't prevent you from going into Honoly early game. This is something I typically do against Regalia because I know that Regalia has very few ways, if no ways at all, that I can think of that they can really remove threats like Honoly, except for expending a lot of resources or running very niche tech cards like a card like Vanguard from V-Series, which on placing on the Vanguard Circle, I believe you Soul Blast and then retire all your opponent's rearguards. But that's a very niche tech card that Regalia is most likely not going to be running, and they don't really have other options that remove from the opponent's field that I can think of. So that is an option off of Liafail, and as aforementioned, you do have the Swordbreaker option early game. Usually that's what you want to go for if you have only 1 Liafail or 1 or only if Liafail is your only grade 2 in your hand. Definitely that's the play to go into. I think Swordbreaker is one of the best things that you can get off of your grade 2 ride. And then you can also go into, if you have another Liafail in your hand, you can go into Liafail into Charon, and then use Charon's skill to get back the counterblast, and then you can use the second Liafail to go into Swordbreaker and then still get the card draw. That way you've decked in a little bit. It's slightly better play, and you've also, of course, Soul Blasted both the card in your soul, so you will need to refill your soul somehow at a later time, but usually that's not a huge deal with the cards that we have in this deck, such as Vicreau and Nightmare Painter. So Liafail, again, amazing card early game. 4 copies is good for this deck, I think, and I don't regret running 4 copies. I think that's not going down anytime soon. All right, and next up we've got 3 Dagda. Pretty standard for Luard. This card is your mid-game, late-game finisher. This is how you create your multi-attacks on your Morfessa turns. This is how you win games. Most of the time, if your opponent has access to Denial Griffin or any form of removal, then they will use that on Dagda. And deservedly so, because Dagda is pretty much what makes Morfessa the scariest. This is what allows you to go into 4 or 5 attacks on a Morfessa turn, which means up to, if they're at 4 damage, that can be up to, if it's 4 or 5 attacks, 10 cards that they need in hand in order to defend against everything. And of course, if they're using G-Guardians, the G-Guardians might not be enough on their own, which means they'll need extra cards. And if they call any cards from hand, then they'll need 2 more. That would still be effectively 3 cards. And if they PG, then they'll need another 3 cards for PGing. So Dagda is really good at just, bringing Morfessa to her maximum power on those turns. And that way we're able to kill our opponent when they're at 4 damage. So I don't think there's much else to say about Dagda. Again, pretty standard for a Luard deck. And 3 copies is perfectly fine because this card does not come up at all early game. You don't really want to see it early game. You want to see it mid to late game when you're going to Morfessa turns. And this begins the non-standard part of our lineup here. We're running 3 copies of OG Nemain. Yes, that is right. Grade 2 Nemain from OG, from BTO4. This Nemain is preferred for me, personally, over the Grade 1 Nemain that we got in V-Series. First of all, because I don't personally like the Nemain Abyssal Owl engine. I do feel like you don't get that much out of it because, especially early game, which is really when you want to go into Nemain Abyssal Owl, you have to spend counterblast on Abyssal Owl most of the time because you won't be the same grade as your Vanguard, as your opponent's Vanguard. Not to mention, I don't like spending Soul Blast too often on card draw. As you saw earlier, the only card I'm really running for Soul Blasting is Charon and Swordbreaker, and Swordbreaker is a 1 of, Charon's a 3 of. And I believe Swordbreaker is still being run in other builds that are running Grade 1 Nemain with Abyssal Owl. So all those cards that Soul Blast are not really favorable in my opinion. However, having this card in this deck has been amazing for me, as long as you don't ride it. Which, I've never had to ride Nemain, thankfully. I think this deck has been really consistent in being able to even if I have to ride Dagda, I'm okay with riding Dagda over riding this card, of course, because you don't want to be riding a 3k card and then they just rush you down on their grade 3 turn from 1 damage to 6. You don't want that to happen. So obviously, this card is not something that you'll be riding. At all costs, you want to avoid riding this card. But if you mulligan this card together with Liafail, then your grade 2 turn becomes really strong. Because basically what you do, if you guys don't know what Nemain does in the first place, because this card is so old, let me go ahead and read it out. So on place on the rearguard circle, you counterblast 1, choose a Shadow Paladin from your hand and discard it, and you draw 2 cards. Very simple. But this card is inherently +1. And not only is it +1, but it gets you that much closer to your Ritual 1, your Ritual 10 in the early game. And I think this card draw early game is what's really helped me in terms of being able to live against strong, fast-paced, high-octane decks that Luard would typically struggle against, because especially since this card can let you draw into your triggers, let you draw into your cards that have high shield value, lets you draw into your... Basically, it lets you more easily see all the cards that you have in your deck, which is very important in all the matchups to which Luard normally dies too early on. So 3 copies of OG Nemain has been great in this deck for me. And as I mentioned earlier, let me actually mention this a little more specifically. So if you have Liafail and Nemain in your hand, you'd ride Liafail, you counterblast 1, call Charon, and Charon skill you Soul Blast the grade 1 that you wrote into, countercharge, and then you call Nemain. You should pitch either a grade 1 or a grade 0 trigger unit, then you draw 2. So that's basically the amazing play for this deck, and Nemain is great. So I definitely prefer running her over the grade 1 Nemain in this deck. And finally, we have 1 copy of the V-Series Morfessa that we got. The only reason why I'm really running this card in this deck is because she's a grade 2 with 10k power, that it counts as a grade 1 in the deck, so you can call her off of Dagda, while also still being able to call her off of all the Luard cards that we have available. That's pretty much the only reason why I'm running her. Basically, Branwen is most of the time better to call off of Dagda or Luard, but the reason why we're still running this is because it is like an extra copy of Branwen. We're only able to run 4 copies of Branwen, so we can't really, we got to find a way to get an extra beat stick in this deck available, so I am running 1 copy of the V-Series Morfessa. I technically do think this card can be replaced by 1 copy of Fuamnak. Fuamnak is from GBT14, so she's from G-Era, and she's technically a 14k card when you have, I think, Ritual 5 it is. I'll put the picture up in this video when I edit it. But basically, Fuamnak is probably a decent option instead of running this card Morfessa. But, you know, Morfessa also looks nice. It's a beautiful art on it, so why not run this, you know? But yeah, 1 copy of Morfessa, and that does it for the grade 2s. So now we're going to the grade 3s. I'll explain them together because, you know, it's Luard, so there's not too much to the grade 3 lineup at all. We're running 4 copies of Dragfall Luard, and we're running 1 copy of Dragheart Luard. So I'll explain the difference between these two and why we're running both of them in the deck and not just one. So we're running the 1 copy of Dragheart Luard solely because we can search it off of Dragwizard Knies. And Knies is the card that you can ride on grade 1 in order to search the top 7 for either Liafail or Dragheart Luard. So that is the reason why we're running 1 copy of this. Not to mention that actually sometimes you'd prefer to get the Ritual 3 stride cost, because let me read its skill quickly out. The first skill is a Ritual 3, which allows you to stride for free as long as you can put back 2 normal units from your drop zone into your deck. So as long as you have 3 grade 1s in your drop zone by the time you ride into this and you're ready for your first stride, which is, you know, you typically have that available, then you can put back 2 normal units instead of the 1 that you put off of Dragfall Luard, which definitely can help if you need those grade 1s in the drop zone back in the deck for some toolbox play or some hand economy play or some control player where you're trying to retire your opponent's rear guards. Basically, the world is your oyster for this deck, so you can really choose what you really want to go for at any time. Very highly adaptable. And the second skill is your stride bonus skill. Upon striding upon it, you counterblast 1 and choose one of your rear guards to retire, and then you search your deck for 2 grade 1 or lower cards, and you call them separate rear guard circles and shuffle your deck. So that skill is actually pretty. It sounds niche, but turns out that sometimes you really want more grade 1s in the drop zone and more grade 1s to call off of your stride bonus. So I think it's still useful to have this available if you need it, because you can get more like you can get like a Honoly together with like a Charon, or you can get a Honoly with a Swordbreaker. Basically, you can get a lot more grade 1s and a lot more abilities from those grade 1s when they're placed. That way you can, you know, have more skills go off. And then also sometimes you want to go for more grade 0s, like a Cursed Raven. You can call Cursed Raven from your deck because it is grade 0 or lower. Or sorry, it's grade 1 or lower. And then you can also go for Belial Owl if you want to retire that for like a Dragabyss Luard or a Morfessa. And then Belial Owl, of course, will allow you to draw a card off of that. And then we're running 4 copies of Dragfall Luard, only because there's no way to search this with a proper grade 1 other than the grade 3 searcher that's given to every clan, which we are running 4 copies of the grade 3 searcher in this deck. But we do still want to run 4 copies of Dragfall Luard because this is your go-to grade 3 ride. This is your go-to toolbox. This is what enables you to, you know, stay in control of the game, play the mid-range, basically allows you to adapt to any matchup that you're playing against with that stride bonus. Let's go ahead and read its skill out quickly here. The first skill is a continuous ability. It's Ritual X. You may pay Counterblast 4 and choose a normal unit from your drop zone and return it to the bottom of your deck as the cost for stride instead of you know, striding the normal way. And this can also be used as a cost for ultimate stride. And you pay this instead of paying the cost for stride. But the thing is, the cost that I mentioned, the Counterblast 4 and return a normal unit from your drop zone to the bottom of your deck, is reduced by Counterblast 1 for every single grade 1 in your drop zone, which is why it says Ritual X. So typically you do not want to use Counterblast for that skill. You do want to be able to do it for free. You want to make sure that when you're riding into this, when you're ready to stride using this card, that you already have 4 grade 1s in your drop zone. That way you can just put a grade 1 in your drop zone, from your drop zone to your deck, and stride for free, basically. And of course, the fact that it allows you to ultimate stride for this as well is really good. Although it won't come up for this deck because we aren't running Ultima. You're not allowed to run Ultima with Overtriggers, so we decided that Overtrigger is more valuable just for the Saki games that we would like to steal over going for an Ultima play, which is typically not a great play for a deck like Luard. Morfessa is most of the time more consistent and a little better. The second skill, before I clean this up, the second skill is the stride bonus. When you stride, you counterblast 1, and then if you do, you search your deck for up to 1 grade 1 or lower card, you call it to a rearguard circle, and then shuffle your deck. And then if you called a unit with the ritual ability, you choose one of your opponent's rearguards to retire. That's in the same column as the unit you called. Now, there's only one card in this deck that we're running that has ritual, and that card is a grade 0 called Vicreau, which is typically the card you want to call off of Dragfall Luard's stride bonus skill. And the way it usually works is if you have Ritual 4, you'll be able to pay the cost for stride for free, right? Which also means that you'll be able to call Vicreau, which is a Ritual 3 card, and you'll be able to immediately get Vicreau's skill off so that you can soul charge, put it into the soul and then you counter charge. And that allows you to do a lot of things for free that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. You could, as I mentioned earlier, you could sub out Morfessa for a Fuamnok That way you also get another card with Ritual in its name, and you'll be able to still retire it with this card's effect, retire an opponent's Rearguard with this card's effect. So I think that does it for the grade 3s. I've explained in great detail the main deck and the decisions behind, like the reasoning behind a lot of the tech cards that I run, and what makes this deck a little more mid-rangey than the typical Luard builds. But now let's go right into the G zone, which I hope to not spend as much time on, but hopefully you get a sense of how this deck is played compared to some of the other Luard builds. All right, so to start off the G zone, we've got 4 copies of Dragabyss Luard. Now most Luard decks run only 2 copies of this, and that's because they're a little faster. They can turbo out Morfessa's Ritual 10 a lot more easily. But as for this deck's a little slower pace because we try to play the hand economy, card economy game. We're trying to really build a lot of resources in our hand. That way we can survive our opponent's pop-off turns early on. And if they don't have any pop-up turns, then we're good to go. Just go into Morfessa right after doing Dragabyss. That way we'll still be able to play the game and such, but we'll have a lot of cards in our hand by the time we go into this. So the reason why we're running this at 4 copies, just in case the pace of the game is a lot slower than we anticipate because of the type of goals we have in the early game, we do want to be able to stride into this again if we haven't already built up that Ritual 10. That way we don't spend a lot of resources, because typically when you go into Morfessa, you do have to spend a lot. Your cards in hand might go down a lot, so Dragabyss Luard allows you to keep your card advantage. Let's go ahead and read its skill out loud. We've got activate ability on Vanguard Circle. So once per turn, you Soul Blast 1, you Persona Flip, and then you choose one of your rearguards to retire, and then you search your deck for up to 2 grade 1 cards, call them to separate rearguard circles, and then shuffle your deck. And if you called 2 units with the Ritual ability, then you choose one of your opponent's rearguards and retire it. Now, of course, we are not running 2 units with the Ritual ability in this deck, so that skill never comes up for this build. However, as I mentioned earlier, you can run Fuamnok instead of Morfessa, the grade 2 Morfessa, in order to fulfill that basically by calling both Vicreau and Fuamnok in order to get that skill off. But most of the time, you're only using Dragabyss Luard in order to get your early game card advantage in order to get closer to your Ritual 10 as well. And then the second skill is a Generation Break 3 continuous ability, and it's a Ritual X. All of your front row units get plus 10,000 power for every 4 of your grade 1s in your drop zone. So this skill almost never comes up. Usually when you go into Dragabyss Luard, you don't have a lot of grade 1s in your drop zone already, which is why you're going into Dragabyss in the first place. Not to mention that you won't even be at GB3 most of the time either when you go into Dragabyss. But if you're going second, then you might have G-guarded already, so you'll probably be at GB3 in that case. Then that's when this will come up, and that front row plus 10 can actually really help putting pressure on your opponent. Most of the time, they'll be guarding a lot early game in preparation for Morfessa, because they know that they want to be able to take a couple of damage off of Morfessa attacks. That way they have a little more leeway, potentially get some triggers to help them out. But having Dragabyss Luard at GB3 puts a little more pressure on them if they're looking out for that. So that's why it does come up sometimes. Most of the time I haven't found it to be too relevant. So yeah, 4 copies of Dragabyss Luard. And then we got, no surprise at all, 3 copies of Dragprincipal Morfessa. This is the ace unit of the deck. This is what has made Luard constantly appear in Premium for so long. And of course, I say so long, but it's really been only existent since 2019, this card at least. But Luard has been a top, one of the best meta decks, or I shouldn't say one of the best meta decks, but one of the decks that continuously showed itself in the meta for a very long time. And ever since Morfessa was released, this card has been the centerpiece of the G zone for Luard. This is what you're targeting with all of the plays that you're making for every single turn. This is what you want to achieve as early as possible if you're able to. For this specific build, we usually don't get Morfessa until the second stride. Now you can go into it on the first stride, but be careful because you might go really minus. It might take a lot. It might take a little too much effort, and plus, early game your opponent might not have a lot of damage, so they just end up taking a lot of damage, and you just wasted your resources on getting them to 5 damage. And then if you give them 5 damage, of course, they can use all that damage in order to kill you the subsequent turn. And if you don't have that many cards in your hand, then you're pretty much in huge trouble. So be careful about going to this card too early. I think with this build, going into it the second stride is most of the time is what is recommended. But of course, you can go into it earlier if you're able to without sacrificing too much of your hand economy. Let's go ahead and read its skill just to make sure we're aware of it. It's an activated ability on the Vanguard Circle, soft once per turn. You counterblast 1 and you flip up a card from your G zone, and then you retire 2 rearguards. Then you draw 2 cards, and until end of your turn, the trigger units in your drop zone are regarded as grade 1. And the reason for that is that it gets you closer to the second ability, which is a continuous ability on Vanguard Circle, active when you have Ritual 10, which means you have 10 or more grade 1s in your drop zone. Your front row gets plus 15,000 power and plus 1 crit, and when your opponent will call cards from hand and Guardian Circle, they must call 2 or more at the same time. So that guard restrict is part of the reason why this card is so oppressive when set up correctly. When your opponent doesn't have that many cards in their hand, they're in huge trouble, especially when they're at 4 damage, because all of your front row gets the crit, meaning that they won't be able to take any more damage unless they're trying to get a heal trigger on the 6 damage or they'll lose. Not to mention, the extra plus 15,000 power means they got to use a couple extra cards in their hand, even if they do get a trigger off of the damage check that takes them to 4 damage, meaning that they'll still probably have to use 2 cards from hand in order to guard everything, unless they go for a G guard. You know, of course, they go for a G guardian. That means they don't have to call cards from hand to Guardian Circle, meaning that it's only 1 card to guard. But Morfessa is, again, very important for this deck. This is what you're really aiming for with all the cards that are in this deck. So make sure to go into it when you can, but don't rush it. If you feel like you're going 2- in order to pull off Morfessa, if you feel like you would have to go 2- in order to go into her, then just go into Dragabyss Luard. You got 4 copies in this deck, so you can safely play the slow game and, you know, grind out your opponent a little bit, which is what kind of the goal of this deck was to do anyway. It's supposed to play a little better of a grind game than the usual Luard build. So yeah, 3 copies of Morfessa. And the reason why we're running 3 copies instead of like 4 or 2, you don't really need 4. 3 is perfectly fine. They'll usually be dead, or they'll have decked out by the time you go into the 3rd one. And then we're not running 2 because you do want to have flexibility. There's not really the other cards in this G zone are not really cards that you go into too often, so there is space to run 3 of her. And that way, if it ever comes to 3, then you just feel a lot more comfortable, and you feel a lot more, you know, like you don't feel like as restricted. You don't feel as under pressure when you have only 2 versus having 3. 3 is just, you know, a lot safer to do instead of 2. So we have space for it, so we might as well. And then the next couple of G units that we're running 1 copy of Drag Strider Luard, 1 copy of Drag Anger Ogma. I said Anger, Drag Anger Ogma. Wow. And then 2 copies, excuse me, of Spectral Blaster Diablo. Wow, that was a mouthful. I messed up on a lot of those. But anyway, these are cards that you almost never go into. We're running them because these were the best stride options for Luard before Morfessa was released in 2019. These cards are still, they're not bad cards at all. They're not bad stride units, but Morfessa just basically, outclasses all of them most of the time. And I've never found these to be strides that I would typically go into. Now, I will say that Spectral Blaster Diablo, or I said Spectral Blaster Diablo, Phantom Blaster Diablo. Sorry about that. I will say Phantom Blaster Diablo, while a little niche, is actually not too bad of a card to go into sometimes. Because, let's go ahead and read its skill. It has a guard restrict, which prevents your opponent from actually guarding cards from hand at all, if you're able to pull off the skill. So the skill is activated ability on the Vanguard Circle. You count up +1 and Persona Flip. And then if the number of face cards in your G zone is 2 or more, until the end of the turn, this unit gets 10,000 power and 1 crit. And then it gets an auto ability on the Vanguard Circle. You choose 3 of your rear guards and retire them. When this unit attacks the Vanguard, you may pay the cost. If you do, your opponent may choose 2 of his or her rear guards and retire them. If they do not, your opponent cannot call cards from hand to Guardian Circle. So there's the guard restrict, as I just said. That can come up if they're at 4 damage, and you know that they don't have any rear guards, and you know that they don't have any G guards as well available, like heal triggers that they can potentially use to G guard, because they can technically G guard still, or even call from Soul if that's possible in their deck. But I find that the other cards here, you typically never go into them. Now, Drag Anger Ogma, I've read its skill a bunch of times. I feel like there are some edge cases where you can actually use this, because it does allow you to play a little bit of a control game if you're able to retire 5 rear guards without losing too much. Because if you retire 5 rear guards, your opponent has to retire and or discard 5 cards from their hand. And then, of course, you draw a card after that. But usually, because it's Ritual 5, and it costs a Counterblast and a Soul Blast, it expends a little too much of your resources without much payoff. So you don't really go into it that much. I found it to just not be as useful as going into like a Dragabyss Luard. And then finally, Drag Strider Luard. This card is a good card too, but again, just outclassed by Morfessa. I don't see it being used most of the time, but I guess, it is an option. If you want to experiment with it, please do so. I won't stop you from that at all, but Just do know that going into Dragabyss Luard and going into Dragprincipal Morfessa are usually your best plays, and you usually never use these cards here. These cards also happen to be good flip fodder for Morfessa, so there is that. All right, so that does it for the G units, or excuse me, that does it for the strides. Now we're going into the G Guardians, so we're gonna have 2 Plotmaker, 1 copy of Gelido, 1 copy of Bronek, and 1 copy of Darkveil. So these are our G Guardian lineup. These are basically the best G Guards that Shadow Paladin has available, and the ratios here are reflective of how often you typically go into these. Now, Bronek is usually the card you go into if you're going, I believe, if you're going first. If you're going first, Bronek is usually better to go into than some of the other ones, because Bronek allows you to check top 5 and call all the grade 1s from that you checked into the Guardian Circle. And that way it actually gets you closer to your Ritual 10 that you want from Morfessa. But Bronek definitely falls off late game when you don't have many grade 1s in your deck. So if you already know that you don't have many grade 1s that you'd get off the top of your deck, like let's say that you have a lot of grade 1s in your hand or you have a lot of grade 1s in your drop zone already, then Bronek is a useless card. You don't want to go into it off of G Guarding. And then in that case, the next best card to go into is usually Plotmaker. Plotmaker is like your mid-game G Guardian. The extra 10,000 shield he gets from Ritual 3 is really easy to pull off. So just having that 25k shield from G-Zone is really nice, and that's typically your mid-game G Guard. And then your other good card is Gelido. Now Gelido is actually, like, the value of Gelido has gone way up ever since V-Series due to the shield value change on grade 1s in V-Series. All the grade 1s in V-Series now have 10k shield, so, or for the most part, not all of them, but most of them have 10k shield. So being able to move your grade 1s from your field to your Guardian Circle, from your rear guards to your Guardian Circle, and then if you move 2, you draw a card. That's really good, and allows you to get up to like 35k shield if you move 2 grade 1s to 10k shield, and then you have Gelido, of course, by yourself. So that allows you to convert 1 heal trigger in your hand into 35k shield, and you draw a card. But of course, keep in mind for Gelido, you have to turn over one of your G Guardians as cost. So typically, if you go into Gelido and you don't have Bronek face up already, you flip Bronek as cost. If you can't flip Bronek, then you just flip up Plotmaker, because Gelido, of course, is better than Plotmaker if you're able to pull it off. And then finally, the other one we're running is Darkveil. Darkveil, I've never found myself using, because it is a super late game card. In order for Darkveil to be the most effective, you need a bunch of grade 1s in your drop zone, and you get 5k for every 2. You don't get 5k for every single one, sadly. I mean, otherwise that'd be insane, right? And of course you have to Soul Blast for Darkveil as well, so you do need to save some soul in order for Darkveil to come up. But when it does come up, it can be really great because it can be surprised from your opponent when they're not expecting they're expecting you to PG like they do an attack with a lot of power, like 60k power, and they expect you to PG, but then you can do Darkveil if you have a lot of cards in your drop zone. You can turn 1 heal trigger into, like, let's say 30 or 40k shield from your G zone, and then you can guard with a couple more cards from your hand to be able to pull it off without having to PG. So Darkveil is good if you want to save a PG and you have the soul to use it. But again, I don't know if Darkveil really comes up that often. I haven't found it to come up that often when I was playing at Spring Fest, nor in the practice matches that I've played before with this deck, and even before then. But yeah, that does it for the G zone. That is also for the rest of the deck profile. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that was a long one. That took almost an hour, but I hope that the in-depth analysis of each ratio in this deck can really help you figure out how you want to play your Luard deck. Or if you want to tailor it to the way I described, then I hope that gives you some ideas or inspiration in order to tweak things to your desires. Or if you really want to take this to a local or something just to get it tested out, feel free to do so. I've had a lot of success with this deck. Of course, I went 3-3 at Spring Fest, so it didn't do amazingly well per se. But I do think part of that was due to some luck and also some lack of matchup knowledge in some instances. For example, against Narukami, I faced Narukami in round 3 and just really played into all the binding. You do want to be careful against Narukami because the more you call rearguards, the worse your bind situation will get. And that also means that you probably won't be able to go into Morfessa anytime at any point in the game if you get all your grade 1s bound. So do make sure that you're careful versus Narukami. And then also, again, when you're going up against fast-paced decks, you want to do everything that you can to slow them down. Make sure that you're able to, keep the game in your control, make use of all the grade 1 toolbox, and that way, eventually, you'll be able to get the grade 1s in your drop zone needed to go into Morfessa, and probably by then, they might either have a lot of cards in their hand, meaning that you'll whittle them down to very few, or they have a few cards in their hand, meaning they'll just die to the Morfessa turn. So just keep that in mind when you're facing certain decks in the meta. But overall, I do think this deck is still a solid Luard deck. It does pretty well against the decks that Luard itself, like the typical Luard builds, suffer against, especially when they get blown up early game. But I also do think that the typical Luard build that you see will probably beat this deck, since it is much faster with cards like the Morian Spear and all the cards from the set that had Claret, Sword, Dragon, and V Series. Those cards help you to turbo out Morfessa a little more easily, because they do get the grade 1s in the drop zone a lot sooner and a lot more efficiently. However, I do think this deck has a better hand economy throughout the whole game, and I do think it can play the grind game really well, which allows you to win matchups against decks that really crash and burn towards the late game, especially like Regalia and such. So yeah, that does it for the deck profile. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions. Please do consider leaving a like, comment, and do consider subscribing as well for more Vanguard videos. I do also do a couple of Yu-Gi-Oh uploads from time to time, but for the most part, I'm going to be doing Vanguard uploads from now on. So yeah, look forward to the next ones. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then.